In 1913, a mathematician at one of the world's most prestigious universities received a letter from the other side of the planet. The handwriting was careful, almost reverent, and the pages were covered in equations that looked like nothing he had ever seen. The man reading the letter was G.H. Hardy of Cambridge, one of the finest mathematical minds of his age. He read the letter, then he read it again. Then, by his own account, he experienced something approaching awe. The equations were not the product of years of formal training, not the refinement of a university education, not the polished work of a man who had spent his life in seminars and lecture halls. They came from a 25-year-old clerk sitting in a small office in Madras, India, earning £20 a year, writing on whatever scraps of paper he could find. A man who had failed his university examinations twice, who had been so consumed by mathematics that the rest of the world simply ceased to exist for him. Hardy would later say, after a lifetime spent in mathematics, after working beside the greatest minds in Europe, that Ramanujan was the single most extraordinary person he had ever encountered. Not because of what Ramanujan had learned, but because of what no one had taught him. So the question this story is asking, the question that will take us from a small town in southern India to the cold stone corridors of Cambridge, from a mother's prayers to theorems that still resist full understanding a century later, is this: what do you become when the world gives you almost nothing and your mind refuses to stop? Welcome to Numbers and Narratives by Bless Wright. I am glad you are here. Today we are going inside the story of Srinivasa Ramanujan, not just the mathematics, but the man. Not just the genius, but the forces that made him. This is a story about a family living on the edge of poverty in colonial India, about a boy who taught himself the mathematics of the universe from a single borrowed textbook, about a culture that gave him his deepest assumptions about reality, about a faith so strong it blurred every line between God and number, and about what happens when a mind of that kind meets the machinery of the modern world. If you have never subscribed to this channel, now is the moment. We do not just tell history here, we go underneath it, we find the roots of greatness. And I promise you, by the time this story ends, you will understand something about how extraordinary minds are formed that you did not understand when it began. There is a revelation waiting at the end of this story, a reframing of everything. Stay with us. To understand Srinivasa Ramanujan, you have to begin not with him, but with the world he was born into, because that world shaped the architecture of his mind before he was old enough to shape anything himself. He was born on December 20, 1887, in Erode, a small town in the Tamil-speaking region of what was then the Madras Presidency of British India. His full name was Srinivasa Ramanujan Iyengar. That last word matters, Iyengar. It designated his family's place within the Brahmin caste, the priestly and scholarly class, and specifically within the Iyengar community, a tradition of Tamil Vaishnavas, devotees of the god Vishnu with deep roots in the temple culture of South India. This was not merely a social designation, it was a complete cosmology, a way of seeing, a set of values so ingrained in daily life that you could not separate the religious from the intellectual, the sacred from the rational. In that world, learning was not a path to employment. Learning was a form of devotion. His father, Kupaswami Srinivasa Iyengar, was a quiet man, a clerk working for a cloth merchant in the town of Kumbakonam, where the family moved when Ramanujan was still an infant. He earned a modest salary, enough to keep the household alive, but barely. He was not an educated man in any scholarly sense. He handled ledgers, recorded transactions, moved numbers across columns. There is almost no record of him expressing opinions about his son's future or his son's mathematics. He was in a way background, necessary, present, but not the animating force of the household. That force was Ramanujan's mother, Kamala Tamil. She was a woman of fierce intelligence and even fiercer devotion. She sang devotional songs at the local Vishnu temple. She had strong opinions about auspicious and inauspicious events. She was superstitious in the way that deeply religious people are, not with fear, but with a kind of active engagement with the invisible. She believed the world was permeated with meaning, that dreams carried messages, that the goddess Namagiri of Namakal, a form of Lakshmi, the consort of Vishnu, spoke directly to those who were attentive. She was, by all accounts, the dominant personality in the family. She had already lost children before Ramanujan. Infant death was common in that era, in that climate, in a household with limited resources. The grief of those losses does not appear in the historical record in any explicit form. But it is reasonable to infer that when this son survived, when this particular child breathed and grew and began to speak, his mother's relationship to him was charged with something beyond ordinary maternal love. He was, in some sense, a miracle she had already practiced losing. She educated him at home before he began school, and what she transmitted was not merely literacy or arithmetic. She transmitted a total orientation toward the world. The gods were real. Knowledge was sacred. The mind was the site of encounter between the human and the divine. And numbers were everywhere, in the temple architecture, in the ritual cycles, in the way the cosmos was organized in Hindu cosmology, with its vast cycles of time and its intricate mathematical symmetries. Ramanujan grew up breathing mathematics the way other children breathed air, not as a school subject, but as the texture of reality itself. He entered the town high school in Kumbakonam at the age of 10. By the time he was 11, he had exhausted what the older students knew about mathematics. He began borrowing books from students at the local government college, working through problems meant for young men 4 or 5 years his senior. A story circulates, not certainly verified but widely reported, that when he asked a teacher to explain the meaning of division, the teacher used an analogy. If you divide 3 bananas among 3 people, each person gets 1. And Ramanujan reportedly replied, or at least thought, that this only works if you have people, that 0 divided by 0 might be 1. He was playing with the concept, turning it over, probing its edges. This was not a student absorbing information. This was a mind already interrogating the foundations. He won academic prizes. He was known throughout his school. There was no mystery about the fact that he was unusual. His teachers could see it plainly. But the Tamil educational system of the late 19th century, even with its Brahmin emphasis on scholarship, operated within the British colonial structure, which meant that learning was ultimately in service of employment. You studied to pass examinations. You passed examinations to become a clerk or a lawyer or a professor or perhaps a government official. Mathematics, real mathematics, the kind that pushes into the unknown, was not the point. The point was utility. When Ramanujan was 15 or 16, something happened that permanently altered his trajectory. A student at the government college lent him a copy of a book called A Synopsis of Elementary Results in Pure and Applied Mathematics, compiled by George Shoebridge Carr, an English mathematician who had tutored students in the 1880s. The book was not a great work of mathematics. It was in some ways a study aid, a massive list of theorems, approximately 5,000 of them, arranged systematically with minimal proofs and no extended derivations. Carr had not always shown his work. He had simply stated results and provided reference numbers. For most students, this would have been a dry and useless tool. For Ramanujan, it was a detonation. He worked through the book methodically, trying to prove every theorem himself, reconstructing the derivations from first principles, verifying results through his own methods. And because Carr had often omitted steps, Ramanujan had to invent the paths between results on his own. He was not learning mathematics. He was teaching himself to think mathematically, in isolation, without correction, without guidance, without anyone to tell him which approaches were standard and which were eccentric. This had an extraordinary consequence. He developed techniques that were entirely his own, sometimes rediscovering results already known in Europe, sometimes arriving at entirely new ones, and he had no way of knowing the difference. It is worth sitting with that for a moment. Ramanujan was not trained in the great tradition of 19th century analysis, the rigorous proof-heavy style that mathematicians like Cauchy and Weierstrass had developed in Europe. He had not been taught to build his arguments brick by brick, justifying every step. He had learned instead to see, to perceive pattern and structure as if they were visually present, to arrive at results through a form of mathematical intuition that resembled, more than anything else, the way a musician hears a chord and knows immediately that it resolves to another. His family's economic circumstances during these years were a constant pressure. His father's salary was small. The household survived on that salary, on what Kamala Tamil earned from her temple singing, and on whatever they could borrow or be given. There was always the possibility of genuine poverty just around the corner, and yet Ramanujan spent his days on mathematics. He filled notebooks, not the pages of assigned schoolwork, but private notebooks he maintained himself, cramming them with results, conjectures, identities, and formulae that no one else in his world could read or evaluate. In 1904, he received a scholarship to the government college in Kumbakonam. It should have been the beginning of a successful academic life. Instead, it was his first great failure. He was so consumed by mathematics that he neglected everything else: English literature, history, physiology, the other subjects required for a well-rounded degree. He failed his examinations. He lost the scholarship. He tried again at another institution, Pakayappa's College in Madras, and failed again for the same reason. By the time he was in his late teens, he had no degree, no institutional affiliation, no income, and no path forward that anyone around him could clearly see. He was also, by this point, married. In 1909, following the customs of his community, his mother arranged his marriage to a girl named Janaki Amal, who was then about 10 years old and would not come to live with him as his wife until several years later when she came of age. The marriage was not a love match in the modern Western sense, but it was not without tenderness. Later accounts from Janaki describe a husband who was often lost in thought, who would wake in the night and scribble equations, who was gentle but entirely absorbed. The marriage added pressure. He needed employment, he needed money, and he had nothing to offer the world except mathematics that the world could not yet read. These years, from roughly 1905 to 1912, were years of invisible formation. Years in which Ramanujan worked in near total isolation, filling notebook after notebook, not knowing whether any of it had value. He was dependent on the generosity of friends and occasional patrons. He visited mathematicians and professors in Madras and showed them his work, and they were sometimes impressed and sometimes baffled and sometimes both simultaneously. One mathematician, P.V. Seshu Iyer, encouraged him. Another, Ramachandra Rao, a civil servant and amateur mathematician, eventually provided financial support for a period when Ramanujan had literally nothing. Without these small acts of human recognition, the story ends quietly in a small room somewhere in Madras. What kept him going? It is almost impossible to answer that question without taking seriously what Komala Tamil had embedded in him from the beginning. Ramanujan attributed his mathematical insights explicitly and repeatedly to the goddess Namagiri. He said she appeared to him in dreams and wrote equations on his tongue. He said the results came to him from her directly. He was not being metaphorical. He was not performing humility. In the framework of the world he had grown up in the Brahmin Vaishnava cosmology his mother had given him, the boundary between the mind and the divine was not a firm line. Knowledge was revelation, insight was grace. And so the very act of doing mathematics was for Ramanujan simultaneously a religious act. He did not experience doubt in the way that secular thinkers experience it. He experienced confirmation, again and again, that something larger was working through him. This is not incidental detail. This is structural. The faith was not a comfort supplement to the mathematics. The faith was the operating system. By 1911, Ramanujan had begun to publish. His first paper appeared in the Journal of the Indian Mathematical Society. A result about Bernoulli numbers, those strange constants that appear at the intersections of number theory and analysis. The paper was legitimate, original, and it caught the attention of the small community of Indian mathematicians who read the journal. But it was also deeply incomplete by the standards of formal mathematics. He stated results, he gave intuitions, he did not always provide rigorous proofs. In Europe, the paper would have been considered promising but unfinished. In Madras, in 1911, it was enough to announce that something remarkable was present. In 1912, Ramanujan secured a clerical position at the Madras Port Trust. Thanks to the support of several people who believed in him, including the chairman of the trust, who had been persuaded that the young man had genuine ability. He was earning a small but stable salary, and for the first time in years he had the material security, barely but genuinely, to think. He had a desk. He had a job he could do competently without it consuming him. And he had in the margins and the evenings and the early mornings his notebooks. The notebooks were now extensive. Ramanujan had been compiling them for years. 3 main volumes, filled with thousands of results on topics ranging across number theory, infinite series, continued fractions, elliptic integrals, theta functions, and hypergeometric series. Some of these results were known to European mathematicians. Many were not. Some of the known results Ramanujan had derived by methods so different from the established approaches that even the known results looked new. And then there were results, dozens, perhaps hundreds, that no one anywhere had ever written down before. He began writing letters to mathematicians in England. In January 1913, he wrote to G.H. Hardy. The letter opened with characteristic formality and characteristic strangeness. Ramanujan introduced himself as a clerk with no university training. He explained that he had developed results in mathematics and wanted Hardy's opinion on whether they were new. He then listed approximately 95 theorems and identities, many of them involving infinite series, continued fractions, and what would later be understood as the early outlines of the theory of modular forms and Mach theta functions. Hardy and his colleague J. Littlewood studied the letter for 3 hours. Decades later, Hardy would reconstruct their reaction. They had, between them, seen everything. They knew the mathematical literature comprehensively. Some of Ramanujan's theorems they recognized as known but extraordinarily recondite results, the kind that no amateur stumbles onto. Other results they could not evaluate at all, because they had no framework in which to place them. And a handful of results seemed on first inspection to be simply wrong, too wild, too asymmetric, too strange to be true. Except that Hardy and Littlewood, working through the night, could not prove them false either. The verdict Hardy eventually formulated was simple and stunning. The letter was written by a mathematician of the first rank, not a talented amateur, not a promising student. a first-rank mathematician, operating without training, without resources, without colleagues, from the other side of the world. He wrote back immediately. In April 1914, Srinivasa Ramanujan arrived in England. He was 26 years old. He had never left India before. He was a deeply observant Brahmin, vegetarian by religious conviction, accustomed to preparing his own food according to ritual requirements. He arrived in a country that did not know what to do with him on any register except the mathematical. Cambridge in 1914 was one of the intellectual centers of the world. It was also cold, gray, structurally hierarchical, and entirely alien to everything that had formed Ramanujan's interior life. The mathematical culture there was precise, rigorous, demanding. Hardy's style, and Hardy was perhaps the leading pure mathematician in England at the time, was built on absolute clarity of proof, on the chain of logical necessity that admitted no gaps. Ramanujan worked by intuition and then constructed explanations after the fact. When he could, he often could not. Results arrived to him whole. The scaffolding was missing. What followed was one of the most extraordinary collaborations in the history of mathematics, and also quietly one of the most asymmetrical. Hardy tried to teach Ramanujan rigor. He tried to show him how to write proofs that European mathematicians would accept, how to build the careful architecture of justification that formal mathematics required. Ramanujan learned some of this. His later papers are more formally structured than his early notebooks, but he never fully inhabited the mode. His mind simply did not work that way. He did not assemble results from axioms, he perceived them, and his perception was, by any reasonable assessment, astonishingly reliable. The work they did together on the partition function stands as one of the landmarks of 20th century mathematics. A partition of a number is a way of writing it as a sum of positive integers, where order does not matter. The number 4, for instance, can be partitioned as 4, as 3 plus 1, as 2 plus 2, as 2 plus 1 plus 1, or as 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1, giving 5 partitions. As numbers grow larger, the number of partitions grows extraordinarily quickly, in a way that is not immediately obvious from the definition. Ramanujan and Hardy developed what became known as the Hardy-Ramanujan asymptotic formula, a precise approximation for the number of partitions of any sufficiently large number. The formula was later refined by Hans Rademacher into an exact result, but the original insight, the essential shape of the answer, came primarily from Ramanujan. What is remarkable, looking back at the partition work, is not just the result itself but the method Ramanujan used to arrive at it. He was working with objects, modular forms, and what would later be understood as mock-modular forms, that European mathematics would not fully formalize for another several decades. He was navigating by a kind of structural intuition, sensing the correct form of the answer before the theory that justified the form had been invented. Hardy, who was better at formal machinery than Ramanujan but less gifted in raw perceiving, contributed the rigorous framework. Together they made something neither could have made alone. Ramanujan also did profound work on highly composite numbers, numbers with more divisors than any smaller number, on the tau function, on Ramanujan's conjecture, later proved by Pierre Deligne in 1973, earning Deligne a Fields Medal, on infinite series for the constant pi, and on continued fractions of extraordinary complexity. His series for pi in particular converges so rapidly that each additional term adds roughly 8 correct decimal digits, a result that modern computer scientists use to this day in algorithms for computing pi to trillions of decimal places. He published results on the distribution of prime numbers, on hypergeometric functions, and on what he called Mach theta functions in some of the last letters he ever wrote, results so ahead of their time that mathematicians did not fully understand their significance until the 21st century. There is a number associated with him that has become famous beyond mathematics, 1729. The story goes that Hardy came to visit Ramanujan in the hospital, where Ramanujan was already ill, and mentioned that he had arrived in a taxi with the number 1729, which seemed to him a rather uninteresting number. Ramanujan replied immediately that 1729 was in fact the smallest number expressible as the sum of 2 cubes in 2 different ways, 1 cubed plus 12 cubed and 9 cubed plus 10 cubed. Hardy later used this anecdote to illustrate what he called the intimacy with numbers that Ramanujan possessed. Not memorized curiosity, but a living relationship with the mathematical landscape, such that any number you named came with a complete biography. This quality, this intuitive familiarity with numerical structure, came directly from the formation, from the years of isolation with Carr's textbook, from the texture of Hindu cosmology in which numbers were not abstract but sacred, from a mother who had taught him that the world was full of invisible pattern and that the properly attentive mind could perceive it. He was not merely calculating. He was, in his own understanding, listening. But England was destroying him, slowly, then not so slowly. The cold did not agree with Ramanujan's physiology. The food was a constant problem. He could not eat what the college kitchens prepared, and he was largely cooking for himself, which meant he was often not eating well or enough. He was lonely in a way that is very specific. The loneliness of being surrounded by intelligent, even admiring people and still being essentially alone. Hardy and Littlewood respected him enormously. Some of his Cambridge colleagues were warm toward him. But the world he had grown up in, the rhythm of the temple, the smell of the South Indian street, the sound of his mother's voice singing to Namagiri, the particular quality of a morning in Kumbakonam, none of that was accessible to him. And for Ramanujan, these things were not background, they were load-bearing. They held his interior life together. He became ill. The diagnosis at various points included tuberculosis, which was both common and often fatal in that era, and a possible hepatic amoebiasis, an infection of the liver. The exact nature of his illness has been debated by medical historians since, but the trajectory is clear. From roughly 1917 onward, Ramanujan spent significant periods in sanatoriums and nursing homes, alternating between brief recoveries and sharp declines. He had come to Cambridge a young man in reasonable health. The English climate, the dietary compromises, the isolation, the total absence of everything that had nourished him from childhood. These things worked on his body at the same time that his mind was operating at its highest pitch. Mathematics poured out of him even in hospital beds. He wrote letters to Hardy containing theorems. He filled new pages in his notebooks. The mind did not stop. The body paid the bill. In 1918, he was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society, one of the highest honors in British science and one granted rarely to mathematicians. He was 30 years old. Hardy had campaigned hard for the election, and the recognition was real and earned. There is a photograph from that period, Ramanujan in a suit, formal, slightly stiff, looking directly at the camera, in which the honor and the exhaustion are simultaneously visible. He had arrived, and he was already leaving. There is something almost unbearable about the record of these years, because both the mathematics and the suffering intensify in parallel. In 1919, unable to recover fully in England, he returned to India. He was 31 years old. He had been in Cambridge for 5 years. He arrived back in Madras in poor condition, still clearly ill, and was taken in by his family, who had followed the news of his career with pride and bewilderment in roughly equal measure. His wife, Janaki, who had barely been able to see him during his years in England, the separation had been long and difficult, was now caring for him along with his mother. The relationship between Ramanujan and his mother was, in these final months, another kind of painful geometry. Kamala Tamil had been the great shaping force of his interior life. She had given him his faith, his orientation, his conviction that the mathematics was something received rather than constructed. She had also, during his time in England, reportedly intercepted some of Janaki's letters to him, a sign that the family dynamics were not without tension. Ramanujan was caught between the world his mother had made him for and the world he had actually gone out and encountered. He spent his final months in Kumbakonam, in the house where he had grown up, doing mathematics. He wrote letters to Hardy that contained some of the most extraordinary material of his entire career, results on what he called Mach theta functions, objects of such structural richness that they would anchor an entire field of research nearly a century later. He was dying and he was still discovering. The mind was to the last more alive than the body that housed it. Srinivasa Ramanujan died on April 26, 1920. He was 32 years old. Hardy later said that the greatest regret of his professional life was that he had met Ramanujan too late. That if Ramanujan had come to Cambridge 10 years earlier, when he was in his mid-teens, his physical health might have withstood the transition. His formal training could have been extensive, and the collaboration might have yielded 10 times what it actually produced. Hardy meant this as a tribute. But there is something in it that also deserves examination, because the assumption embedded in that regret is that formal training would have made Ramanujan more productive, and that assumption is not obviously true. Here is what history has usually misunderstood about Srinivasa Ramanujan. The standard narrative frames him as a genius who overcame his lack of formal training, who triumphed despite the absence of rigorous education, who produced great work in spite of working alone, in spite of poverty, in spite of a colonial system that barely acknowledged his existence. This is a beautiful story, and it is not entirely wrong. But it misses something essential. Something that, once seen, changes the meaning of everything. Ramanujan did not succeed despite his formation. He succeeded because of it. The isolation was not a deficit to be overcome, it was a crucible. When you work through mathematics alone, without a teacher to confirm your methods, without a tradition to inherit your habits from, you are forced to develop your own ways of seeing. You cannot rely on received wisdom, because you have very little of it. Every path you walk alone. And some of those solitary paths lead somewhere that the well-worn roads never reach. The faith was not a psychological comfort unrelated to the mathematics. It was the lens through which Ramanujan perceived mathematical reality. The Hindu tradition he was raised in, particularly its emphasis on the immanence of the divine in all things, on the universe as a structured whole permeated by meaning, disposed him to look for pattern at every level of numerical reality. He did not separate the sacred from the structural. For him, a beautiful was a revelation in the same sense that a temple hymn was a revelation. Both were encounters with the same thing. This is not romantic metaphor. It shaped what he looked at for and what he was capable of seeing. The poverty was not merely a hardship that his talent survived. It removed the social buffers that ordinarily constrain intellectual development. Ramanujan could not afford to fail in polite, incremental ways. He could not afford to pursue conventional success and leave the mathematics for weekends. The situation was extreme enough to make conventional paths unavailable, which meant the unconventional path, the notebooks, the solitary investigations, the thousands of theorems worked out in private with no guarantee of ever being read, was not a choice he made but a condition he inhabited. And Kamala Tamil, his mother, who ran the household and shaped his inner world and prayed to Namagiri and believed in the sacred character of knowledge, she was not incidental to the mathematics. She was in a very real sense its architect. She gave him the framework in which doing mathematics was not an eccentric personal obsession, but a form of religious practice. She gave him the conviction that the work was worth doing regardless of recognition. She gave him the tolerance for isolation that the work required, because she had structured that isolation as a kind of sanctity rather than a deficiency. What makes Ramanujan extraordinary is not that he was a natural-born genius who would have been great in any circumstances. What makes him extraordinary is that a very specific set of circumstances, a Brahmin household in colonial Madras, a devotional mother, a particular book, a particular kind of poverty, a particular faith, combined to produce a particular shape of mind that could access parts of mathematical reality that more formally trained minds were not equipped to see. G.H. Hardy gave the mathematics a scaffold. He gave it rigor, publication, the vocabulary of European analysis. But the mathematics itself, the raw, torrential, still not fully understood body of results in those notebooks, came from somewhere else. It came from Kumbakonam. It came from the temple. It came from Carr's textbook and years of solitary verification. It came from Namagiri, if you believe what Ramanujan believed, and it would be intellectually arrogant to dismiss the possibility that the belief itself was causally important, that the conviction of divine assistance, whatever its ultimate source, produced a quality of intellectual fearlessness that purely secular doubt might have undermined. When modern mathematicians open those notebooks, and they are still working through them a century later, still finding things they cannot fully explain, what they encounter is not the product of a lucky untrained amateur who happened to get things right. They encounter the output of a mind shaped by a complete civilization, operating at a frequency that formal training might actually have dampened. This is what history misunderstands. The question was never, how did he succeed without the advantages? The question was always, what if what looked like disadvantages were actually, in some deep and specific way, the conditions of his particular genius? Srinivasa Ramanujan lived for 32 years. In that time, he filled 3 notebooks with thousands of results, many of which are still being studied, still being proved, still being understood. He published fewer than 40 papers. He died before he could do what Hardy believed he was capable of. And yet the body of work he left behind has influenced number theory, combinatorics, analysis, mathematical physics, and even string theory in ways that could not have been predicted and cannot be fully accounted for. There is a concept in mathematics called an open problem, a question that has been precisely formulated but not yet answered. Many of Ramanujan's results remained open problems not because he stated them as questions, but because he stated them as truths that no one else could yet verify. He saw the answer. The proof came later, sometimes decades later, sometimes still not at all. That is either the signature of extraordinary intuition or extraordinary calculation or something for which we do not quite have a word. What his story leaves us with, what I want you to carry away from this, is a particular way of looking at the formation of exceptional minds. They are not formed in spite of difficulty. They are formed in difficulty, out of difficulty, by the specific shape that difficulty takes. The isolation that looked like a lack was a workshop. The faith that looked like superstition was a methodology. The poverty that looked like an obstacle was a concentrating force. The mother who prayed to a goddess was transmitting, along with the theology, something that functioned like a theory of knowledge. That the universe is structured, that the mind is capable of perceiving that structure, and that the perception of structure is the highest act available to a human being. Ramanujan believed that. He lived that. And because he lived it completely, without the moderating skepticism of secular rationalism, without the caution of formal training, without the social pressure to produce work that was fashionable or timely or immediately useful, he could see things that no one else could see. The notebook is still open. The work is not done. And somewhere in what left behind is the record of a mind that was, in the fullest sense, shaped by everything it encountered. Every deprivation, every devotion, every solitary morning with a pencil and a borrowed book, into something the world had never quite seen before and has not quite seen since. If this story changed the way you see what makes a great mind, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. If you are new to Numbers and Narratives by Blesswright, this is what we do here. We go beneath the surface of great lives and find the forces that form them. Subscribe, leave a comment telling me which part of this story stayed with you, and I will see you in the next story.